Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to the first of 2017 Teaching and Learning Breakfast Series. Stuart Dinmore, I'm an academic developer at the Teaching Innovation Unit, and I'm really happy to welcome a colleague from the northwest of the United States, Sheryl Burgstahler. She's a one of the leading researchers and thinkers on the topic of universal design. And today she's going to talk to us about a topic that's very dear to all of our hearts here at UniSA, and that's universal design in online learning. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sheryl. Thank you very much, Sheryl.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about these days, so this is a treat for me. I wish I was in Australia with you, though. I've been in Sydney and I've been in Perth, and wow, you have a beautiful country, and it's a long distance between those two cities, by the way. So here we are. I will be going through my PowerPoint slides, but you will have access to them afterwards, so you shouldn't have to take any notes. Let's just sit back and talk about online learning and how we can make it more welcoming and accessible to everyone. So let's take a look at the terminology. You may not be using the same terms that I do, so let's make sure we're on the same page. So online learning, digital learning, e-learning, distance learning, online education, computer-assisted learning, hybrid courses, flipped classes, all of those would be classified in the online learning that we're talking about today. And also, besides universal design, there are other design terms that are used for similar concepts. Barrier-free design, inclusive design, design for all, accessible design, usable design. The way I use the term universal design is expressed in this triangle, where universal design is designing a product where it is specifically accessible to people with disabilities, it's usable by everyone, and it's inclusive as well, rather than something that might segregate people. I found two centers, run them today at the UW. One of them is the Access Technology Center. Founded that in 1984, been here a long, long time. It's funded by the University of Washington and focuses on making sure that people with disabilities have access to technology here on our campus. And then the other center, which is the one that funds more of my general work, is the DoIT Center, where DoIT stands for Disabilities, Opportunities, Internetworking, and Technology, founded in '92. And that particular center is supported with federal, state, corporate, and private funds. We have a DoIT Japan program in 2007, and just recently we've expanded one into open in Singapore. So what are we trying to do in our programs? Well, we're trying to, for students with disabilities, to promote self-determination, empowering use of technology, success in challenging post-secondary studies and careers. But the other hat we wear is for institutions, which is what we're doing today, where we're trying to promote IT, services, courses, all aspects of academic life that are welcoming to, accessible to, and usable by all potential students, including those who have disabilities. Some of you may be familiar with a book that I edited called Universal Design in Higher Education, From Principles to Practice. Second edition was published in 2015, and my claim to fame isn't so much being the editor or lead author, it's that I recruited 40 leaders in the field to be authors and co-authors of the chapters, and so you hear directly from them. It's peer-reviewed, published by Harvard Education Press, and if you look on our website, the DoIT website at uw.edu/DOIT, you'll see you can get a discount, about a 20% discount. We also support a community of practice related to the topic of that book. It's at doit@uw.edu is the email address where you'd send a message saying that you'd like to join that group if you want to continue talking about this beyond this webinar. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about what it means to be accessible. What are some strategies and resources for making an online course welcoming to, accessible to, and usable by all students? So let's start with the definition. This is actually from our Office of Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education, so it's federal. And I think it's a very good definition. Accessible means a person with a disability is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. The person with a disability must be able to obtain the information as fully, equally, and independently as a person without a disability. So it's a pretty broad definition, basically saying that individuals with disabilities should just be able to do the things the rest of us do. Seems reasonable, but not always easy to implement. So if we think about even more broadly than disability, but think of student characteristics, if you think of who's in your class, they might have different communication skills, marital status, age, their ability to see things or hear things, their social skills, their values, their age, socioeconomic status, their race, their gender, and all of these play into how well they'll receive your instruction. And so you want to think as broadly as you can. If we narrow down and look at ability, you can think of the ability of a particular person on a continuum from not being able to do something to being very able. So rather than think about a medical diagnosis that would result in someone saying they have a disability, you can just think of variety in ability levels, and that would be the ability to see. Where way down on the left toward that area, you would be totally blind, and on the right have exceptional sight. So everyone is on the continuum somewhere. And the ability to hear and walk and read print, the ability to write or communicate verbally, to tune out distraction, to learn, to manage physical and mental health. You can look at these characteristics and say, yeah, at some point, in most of them, they would result in a diagnosis of a disability if they were moving down that road toward not able. But that's not really important unless you're somebody in the medical field that needs to know those diagnoses. The important thing is to remember the variety of abilities that will be in your class. Just assume that they'll be there. You don't have to ask a student, just assume that they'll be in your class. Now, there are two approaches to access in our country, and probably yours, as much as I know about your country, and that is universal design or accommodations. Both are really important, but unfortunately accommodations is used more often than it needs to be. So on online courses, for example, at the University of Washington, the two most common accommodations are the accessible documents problem, creating accessible documents, mainly reformatting PDF files that are created in an inaccessible format, which we'll talk about in a minute. Last numbers were 26,000 pages each quarter. We have a campus of about 50,000 students, so a lot of pages. And the biggest expense, second big expense they have in disability services in accommodations is to convert videos to an accessible format for students who are deaf. So we've had 55 hours a quarter costing about $10,000 a year just on making videos captioned because a student is enrolled in a class where they need captioning. So rather than relying on accommodations alone, we should consider designing the course to be more welcoming accessible to and usable by a broad audience from the beginning. We can use a little analogy here. Imagine that you're using this coffee pot, which happened to have a spout and a handle on the same side. And this is from the catalog of unfindable objects, and it's called the Coffee Pot for Masochists. Now, if we look at this product, I think most of us would agree it'd be better to design a better coffee pot than to try to make modifications to this one to make it accessible. And so rather than take a course that's designed not to be very accessible, we should go back to the drawing boards and design a better product. So here's a quote that I like to share at this point. When you plant lettuce, if it does not grow well, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons it is not doing well. It may need fertilizer, it may need water, it may need sun. It's from a Buddhist monk in Vietnam, and it relates very well to online instruction or other types of instruction. That when a student doesn't do very well, we should look at our teaching. It's not always on our side; they may not be studying, but we should look and see if we could do things a different way that would help them to learn. So that's where universal design comes in as an approach to do all this. The design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. This is from the Center for Universal Design. So if you look at universal design, it can be presented on a continuum. For example, here's a young man in a wheelchair opening a door. Looks a little awkward to him, but my guess is technically accessible to him. He seems to be able to open that door. We could make it more accessible to different people if we put a button, so a person could push the button to open the door. That would have made it easy for him, but there's still a lot of people that wouldn't have the capability to push that button. And so in the third case, we have just the typical grocery store in the United States where you walk up to the door and there's a sensor and it just opens right that moment. So it doesn't matter what physical capabilities you have or how tall you are or what other characteristics that might make another approach not as feasible. We can apply that to captioning videos. If you have an uncaptioned video, it's accessible to a lot of people, but there are some people that it won't be very accessible to, someone who's deaf, for instance, but also someone where English is not their first language and would benefit from text as well as audio. It's not very accessible to them. So you could provide an interpreter for the deaf student, but that would only help the deaf students. You could caption the video, and that would provide access to the deaf student, plus the student where English is not their first language. And if you added audio description, which is a little bit of audio text, spoken word that describes some of the key visuals, just like I described the 3 visuals right up on the screen right now, but you have that in the video, then that would make it more accessible because a person now who's blind would be able to access all of that content. So universal design is on a continuum. I actually taught the first year online course at the University of Washington. It was 1995, and I taught it with Dr. Norm Coombs, and it was called Adaptive Technologies for People with Disabilities, and we taught it over the years, and there were actually a few people from Australia that took that course, as I recall. The technology we used is email, discussion list, Gopher, Telnet, file transfer protocol. Some of you aren't old enough to know about all those technologies, but that's what we were using back then. We had all of our materials in a text-based format, and we mailed materials. Some of our videos were, or all of our videos were captioned and audio described, and they were mailed to the students to read. Now, I teach another course currently through Rutgers University, an online course, and it's about accessibility too, on accessibility and compliance of online education, and it's for online instructors and course designers, and we use an online asynchronous universally designed format, and that course is designed to be fully accessible as well. The technology has changed, but the basic issues have not. The 2 basic issues about gaining access to online learning for a person with disabilities is that the students with disabilities need access to the assistive technology they need. So a student who's blind would probably need a screen reader technology that will read the text on the screen and a speech synthesizer to read the text out loud to them. And that's what Norm Coombs did when he took this course. He taught the course with me because he does happen to be blind himself. So that's one part of the issue. As an online instructor, you don't have to worry too much about that. You don't have to know about that specific technology. The student who's going to take your course and needs it will have access to it through their school or through their own means, which is probably more common. And then the second thing that's common about both those courses I mentioned is that online courses need to be universally designed with respect to the learning management system. Most of us as instructors can't do a lot about that except provide feedback to the learning management system producers as far as accessibility. You need instructional materials that are accessible. So if you're providing documents, PDF documents or PowerPoint documents or whatever, those materials need to be accessible. And then the instructional strategies need to be accessible. So let's just take a look at 3 students that might be in your class, which of course be accessible to them. Anthony is well employed as an AT specialist, as assistive technology specialist at Prent Q Roman Company. He has cerebral palsy, which makes it difficult for him to use his hands, and he doesn't have a usable voice. So he uses the technology grammar and spell checkers, a synthesized voice on a communication device. He does use a touch screen for communication, and he has a computer-based environmental control and phone access system. And so he provides technical support to people who are new to assistive technology. And I have to smile when I think about mothers and fathers that have a child who's newly diagnosed with cerebral palsy that might be calling him for advice, and then they quickly realize that he himself has cerebral palsy and is a very, very successful computer guy. So that's kind of cool. Imka, she's a climatologist. She has a PhD in atmospheric sciences here from the University of Washington. She's totally blind. She works for the National Weather Service. She uses speech output. so that she can hear the text that's presented on the screen. She can provide input to the computer using a keyboard. Braille translation software and a Braille display and a printer, so she can get output in Braille, and she can develop it herself. And she uses speech input and a Morse code foot switch, which she can enter commands with her feet. Now, the reason she needs those two last things is because that she uses a computer so much that she has carpal tunnel issues like many people do, and so she is using other types of assistive technology to gain access to her computer, so she doesn't have to use her hands for everything. And the third person I'll highlight is Jessie. She has a bachelor's degree in informatics, and she's a business analyst at Amazon.com. She has multiple learning disabilities that make it difficult for her to get things out on paper, but also to read. So she uses speech output, so she can listen to the content presented on the screen. She can see the content, but that isn't her problem, but processing it is slow unless she has the audio coming along with the visual. She uses speech input because she has a hard time getting her ideas down on paper or through the keyboard. And she uses a grammar and spell checker that deals with some of her reading difficulties, language difficulties because of her disability. So she uses this technology still in the workplace, but it also helped her get to that point through college. So if we're going to look at applying universal design to online learning, some simple ways to look at it is to provide multiple ways for representation, for engagement, and for action and expression of the students. So multiple ways for them to do things. These are the three principles developed by the Center for Applied Special Technology, or CAST. We've also developed a list here in the Do It Center that we think is a little easier for educators to understand exactly what we're talking about, but it results in the same thing as if you use the CAST list. So we talk about providing multiple ways for your students to gain knowledge. So how are they going to gain knowledge? Maybe you're using a video to gain knowledge. Can you create a handout with the same content so they can gain that knowledge in two different ways? Multiple ways to interact, so small groups, large groups, different types of technology, and making sure that some of them are accessible. And then different ways to demonstrate knowledge rather than just one type of exam, having multiple ways someone can show that they mastered the content of your course. So let's look at some specifics. Ooh, I think I lost the headings. It didn't look this way on my screen. There are some headings there that we lost in translation. But what we have is two columns here. One saying what the capabilities, limitations of assistive technology can be, and on the right, what should be the response when you're developing technology or materials for your classes. So AT emulates the keyboard. So there are literally thousands of assistive technology devices available, and you don't need to know about all of them, but you need to know a few things. And that is that one of it is that they can emulate the keyboard. So a person using that technology can access all the keys on the keyboard just like you and I do. But it doesn't necessarily fully emulate the mouse. And so what that means to a developer is that software and websites, etc., should be designed to operate with the keyboard alone. So now that's kind of in the category of your learning management system or the website that you're going to. But that's an important thing for developers. Assistive technology cannot accurately read the content presented in images, like if an image of a map with things labeled on it. It can't read those labels because it's just an image to the screen reader. So you need to provide alternative text so that the person who's blind in this case, who can't access the image, can access a description of the image, featuring the content that's most important. That same technology, a screen reader, can tab from link to link. Now you may wonder why a person who's blind would want to do that. Well, imagine if you're reading the web page and you're just reading all the content, and the person you would just want to know what was on the page, so you decide if you can find what you want there, or you know it's on the page, but you just want a certain link. What a blind person would do with using a screen reader is they would tab, and link through or skip through all of the links. That would be a shortcut way to find what that content is that is linked to from the page. Now, if you make all of your links, click here, click here, click here, that's all they're going to hear. And so what do they have to do? They have to go back to the beginning of the page, and they have to read every word on the page to figure out what is the surrounding text of that link here. or click here to see where it's linking to. Similarly, a person who's blind can skip from heading to heading with their screen reader. And so if you just, in a document, but you just bold the materials, the sections that are supposed to be headings, but you don't use the style sheet in Word, for instance, then the person who's blind doesn't have anything to skip through. And again, it's kind of like the link situation. They're not able to just get a sense of what the organization of that paper is before they read the whole thing. So they have to read it from the beginning to the end, where maybe they were only interested in the last section, but they can't find it because you didn't use the heading structure. So it's important that people who develop Word documents or PDF files use hierarchical headings. And it cannot transcribe the audio. And so it's important that we caption our videos and transcribe audio of audio files. One thing to note here is some of us find it humorous to look at the YouTube videos that are captioned, and many times they're actually silly because it's a computer that's generating those captions. What the owner of that video didn't know or else chose not to do is that's just the first draft of those captions. They're supposed to go back and edit them, and so that they make sense to the people that are actually viewing those videos. So one place to start in your course is the syllabus. Is it welcoming? Is it friendly? Is it structured under these subheads as I just mentioned? Is it an accessible format? So is it text or is it scanned in PDF, which would not be accessible? Does it include key information like the instructor information, including the office hours or whatever you want to put on there, the course description, the learning objectives? And does it include the target audience so they know if they're right in the right class? What technical level you expect the students to have to take your online course? I, in my course, have optional content, because sometimes there's something really cool I'd like the students to watch, a video or something, but it really isn't essential for getting through the class. And so I respect their time by saying, well, this is optional, but you might want to go and check it out. And it also, in the syllabus, includes clear expectations. Share your assignments and grading. Share them in such a way in your syllabus that a person could get started on them early. Imagine that a student with a learning disability is in the course and they know that it's going to take them more time to finish an assignment. They should be able to start that early and then provide them with specific information about the grading so they know what the expectations are. Includes the required reading, and if you can make your syllabus available early, that's a good idea because, again, some people might want to start the reading ahead of time. Include statements about accessibility, and I recommend you have 2 statements. Often you provide the disability-related accommodation statement from your institution, as I do in my class. That is important. But in my class, I include another statement, which is more of a personal statement from me, saying something along the lines that it's my goal in this course that this course be accessible and usable for all of the students. If you find some characteristic or tool in my course that is not, please let me know. And so basically, and I put that one first, by the way, basically you're telling them, I as an instructor care about accessibility. I'm building that in my class. But yes, of course, if it still can't be made accessible, you can use the Disability Services Office for an accommodation. Well, now I'm going to take a look at the publication that I wrote a couple years ago, and I continue to modify as I get ideas from people like you. So it's called 20 Tips for Teaching an Accessible Online Course. If you go to the Do It website with the URL at the end of this publication, or this PowerPoint publication, you will see what that URL is, and you can just select type in 20 tips and you'll find it quickly. I created this because I gave a lot of talks on online learning and people wanted kind of a short checklist. Yeah, well, where should I get started? And so this is the where to get started document, and I'll go through these very quickly, but I recommend you get it from the website, and it is pretty much a checklist for you. The advantage of going to the website too is many of these I provide a URL that provides more information about the specific item. There are 9 tips for web pages, documents, images, and videos, and then 11 tips for instructional strategies that you might use. So you might think through these as we go through them and think of what would be the hardest for you to do. Some of this is easy and some is really hard. Using clear, consistent layouts and organization schemes for presenting content, that shouldn't be too hard, but that can really help students with disabilities. Structure the headings. We already talked about why you should do that. So you want to use the heading style features that are built into the learning management system, Word, PowerPoint, PDFs, You find them everywhere. And then use built-in design layouts. Like if you use a design layout that is built into the PowerPoint slides, those tend to be accessible. And so you can, that will get you on the right path. Use descriptive wording for hypertext links. I just told you why that's important. It's because of the assistive technology capabilities some of your students might be using. And so we would use Do It Center as the name of a clickable item instead of click here. And then avoid PDFs presented as images. So avoid those that are just scanned in, because individuals using screen readers, they could be blind and using screen readers, or they might have dyslexia or another learning disability and they want to have their screen reader read to them as well, but they cannot read the text presented in images. So make sure that the text is accessible. And this can be accomplished through creating an accessible PDF. And there are guidelines on our website for doing that. That's a whole separate presentation. And then you can check to see if it is accessible before or after you've done your remediation. You can tell really fast if a PDF is basically accessible if you just try to select some of the text, a few words or one word. If you can select the text, then it's been designed in an accessible format to some degree. There are other things to look at, but that would be one criteria. If you try to select something and you can't select it, can't highlight it with your mouse, then it's not accessible. It's just an image you're looking at. It just looks like there's text there. And so if you use an inaccessible PDF, you could create a text-based alternative. If you go to the Do It website, we have about 100 publications. And our standard for presenting them is they are presented in an HTML format. HTML is one of the most accessible ways you can deliver content. And we make sure that it's formatted, so the headings are formatted and so forth. So it's very accessible, and that's the version we present on the website. But with the click of a button, you can go to a PDF version of that publication. So if you wanted to print it, you might want to use that version. But we just provide both. But we have designed the PDF to be fully accessible as well. But it does require that the person viewing it, if they're blind, that they have Adobe and so forth. So if you look at these four, you know, which would be the hardest to do you think as an instructor? Anybody want to type that into the chat? Of those four things, which one would you find most challenging? Well, I can answer that myself. I think it's the fourth one. So there you can identify something that you'd have to get some extra help with. Yes, option 4. Thank you. I'm hearing that in chat here too. So great. But you know, some people say, well, I don't even know the first thing about doing that. Well, don't let that bother you so much that you don't do 1, 2, and 3 that are easy ones. But it's probably something you're either going to have to explore online. Lynda.com, Lynda.com, which does online training, has a really good PDF accessibility online course that you can take you sign up for $30 a month to take all their courses, and so that's a good way to learn about that. But also there's a URL in the publication itself. Provide concise text descriptions of content presented within images. So you don't have to describe the whole image, like the color of the background and so forth. Ask yourself, what is the content presented in that image before you use alternative text to describe it. I like to think about it as, imagine somebody's on the phone and you're describing the content of that image. What would you tell them about it? That's what a person who's blind needs to know. Use large, bold fonts on uncluttered pages with plain backgrounds. That can be if you're putting things within the learning management system, or you're using PowerPoint, as I am today. If you notice, I'm using large, bold fonts with an uncluttered background, kind of to the extreme maybe, but that is important. If you have too much clutter, it's going to be difficult for a lot of people, including some people with visual impairments. And somebody with attention deficits as well. Sometimes the clutter in the background can be really distracting, and so they might not be able to attend to your class as much as you'd like. Include color combinations that are very high in contrast and can be read by those who are colorblind. Red and green are common combinations. People cannot distinguish between red and green. There are a number of checkers on the website. In this handout, I point you to one where you can just check. You can say what color combination you want to use, and it'll tell you whether it's likely to be inaccessible to some people. Making sure all the content and navigation is accessible using the keyboard alone. We talked about that when we talked about limitations of assistive technology. You don't have to know about all those gadgets they're using, but you need to know that. And caption or transcribe video and audio content. Here's another one that I think you'd put on your this is a hard thing to do, or something that I'm going to have to learn to do. But again, we've only come up with 2 in that category, I think, in these top 9 things you do as far as your learning management system and your documents and so forth. So now we'll skip to what you can do as far as your instructional strategies. First thing you should do is just remember that there could be a wide range of technology skills in your audience. You don't have to survey your students about their technology skills. You know, if you surveyed 100 people, there'd be at least one that doesn't have the technology skills that you'd hope for, but they're still capable of taking your class. And so what I do is I will point students to resources, for instance, that will train them how to do the learning management system that I'm using. And I get that information up before the class starts, and so they can work on that. So I give them an option for doing that, and it doesn't mean that I have to require it for all the students. They can self-select themselves. Present content in multiple ways, mentioned that earlier, where you want to have a combination of text and video and images. If you go to the website for the Do It program, we have about 50 videos up there, and every one of them, almost every one of them, has a handout that goes with it. And so if somebody would like to reinforce what they're learning by reading the handout, or they find that that's the best way for them to gain knowledge about that content, they have it right there. Address a wide range of language skills. Some people in your course assume there will be some people where English is not their first language. Things to be careful of is make sure that you spell out your acronyms the first time they're used, and that you avoid jargon or you define it. Some people feel that in the course they're teaching, it's important for the students to learn about the jargon used in that field. Well, that's fine. I don't have any problem with jargon, but be sure you describe it. And if you're using humor, try to use humor that you think would be very inclusive. A lot of people would understand it, but if it's really relevant only to your culture, maybe you should avoid or you should explain what it means. So all that is really important about how you present things. Making instructions and expectations clear for activities, projects, and assigned reading. One of the things that I do when they go to a website is I make it real clear what I want them to do there. So I don't just say, oh, look at this website, and just leave it at that. There are times when I'll just say that my expectation is that you spend 5 minutes at this website just to gain an idea of the content. Otherwise, I want them to do specific things. Make examples and assignments relevant to a wide variety of interests and backgrounds. Try to think of people, different ages from different cultures, when men and women, people is from lots of different walks of life, and give examples that are broadly acceptable, but also a variety of examples in different employment situations or whatever, if you're teaching a course that talks about employment. And offer outlines and other scaffolding tools. This is one that I sometimes get a knee-jerk reaction from faculty, like, gee, why should I get into outlines, or maybe an example of how to take notes in my class. Shouldn't they learn that in high school? And my answer to the second question is, yes, they should learn that in high school. Then my question to them is, but do they know that? Are all of your students really skilled at taking notes? And I always get back, no. Okay, so you as an instructor have to decide what to do about that. And one option is, well, it's their problem. They should have learned that. They didn't, so too bad. Another option is to develop a scaffolding device. I like the word scaffolding because it implies, and it's true, that you're going to build something, you're going to provide this assistance, but then you're going to take it down once the job is done. So, for instance, in a lecture class where maybe you're using technology, but it's a flipped classroom, so you do actually see the students. you might want to share with them an outline of how you outline content that they can apply in the online version of the course, or the content of the course, or even in some of the lectures that you might be presenting. And you do it once or twice. You don't keep doing it, but it might help people that are just learning how to do that. I had a person one time say they had a student on the autism spectrum in their class, and they were really worried that she was going to have difficulty giving a presentation and what options they should provide. There'd been no direction from the Disability Services Office. In fact, this girl hadn't been identified as having a disability, but she clearly did, according to this professor. And as he described her to me, it did sound like someone who might be on the autism spectrum, but she hadn't disclosed that. So I said, no, you can't talk to her privately and see what her issues are with the presentation. I said, but I don't think you should assume that she can't give a presentation. He says, well, she doesn't even make eye contact. She doesn't talk to anybody in the whole class. And so I suggested to him that he create a little 1/2 sheet outline of what he expected for these students to give a presentation. Because when I asked him what he gave them, he said, nothing. I don't care what they do. They got 8 minutes. They can do it any way they want. But having worked with students on the spectrum quite a bit myself, I thought that would be disastrous for many of the students that I know. So I said, well, give me a little outline and say, here's one way you might want to organize your talk. 1 minute for the title and the objective. 1 minute for your explanation of why you decided to explore this issue. On and on and on. And I saw him a few months later, and I asked about that student, and I said, how did it go? He said, just fine. She did the presentation, but Sheryl, I was really surprised. She was right to the minute of that outline that I gave her. But she did a great job. Got an A on it. I said, did any of the other students use that outline? And he says, a few others, a handful of others. And so I said, yeah, that outline probably helped a lot of students, even the ones that didn't use the outline, because it gave them some place to start. Provide adequate opportunities to practice. Sometimes I will provide, I used to teach calculus, and I would provide some optional practice so that all the students didn't have to do all the signs and all the problems that I gave them, but they would get another set of problems where they had answers to those. And that would give the opportunity for more practice for those particular students that needed it. Allow adequate time for activities and projects and tests. I mentioned earlier, assigning them early is a good strategy, and trying to not create situations where they're overly impacted by time. Provide a feedback on a project. That you have a very large project, let's say, maybe feedback on project parts and offer corrective opportunities for those individual parts so that the student doesn't end up at the very end of the term turning in their assignment and they did it totally wrong. They totally misunderstood what you're saying. That's such a sad thing when that happens. Provide options for communicating and collaborating that are accessible to individuals with a variety of disabilities. In the first course that I taught, that I shared with you, as time progressed and we had greater technology, we provided students with an assignment where they had to work in a small group. And I had something that they could do. And what I did in the assignment is I gave them 3 options, I think it was, for communicating in the group. They could use email, they could use a phone conferencing system, and some online chat type system. And maybe even a bulletin board too, maybe it was 4. But anyway, but their assignment, the first item that they had to report back on was to say what tool they used to communicate and why. And most of the people came back and said that they used email because it's so hard to get their group together. And the other tools were synchronous. And one group reported back that they did select email, but it was because one of the participants revealed that she was deaf. Now, that's the only time in the whole class that I knew I had a deaf student, and they didn't say which one, so I still didn't know who she was. But it was a real testament to the fact that my class was fully accessible. She didn't have to disclose her disability, and by the way, she didn't have to then either. She could have just said, I would prefer to use email. I worded it carefully so people didn't have to disclose their disability in that particular way. So you can kind of, in the way you're presenting an assignment, give people options, and then you don't have to worry about every one of them being accessible. They didn't have to worry about everyone being accessible to the people that are in the group. And then provide options for demonstrating learning. So they don't just have a bunch of multiple choice tests of the same old, but there are different ways that they can show you that they've learned the content. Well, that's a list of 20. And so I'll conclude with a couple of comments. One of them is sometimes you'll run into a tool that you know is not very accessible. And one of them is this Voki.com, which I've used. And it's there are other ones out there that are more complex actually, but it allows you to create and animate an avatar. And so you can choose your image of yourself. And so I chose this first one actually, but we have 3 different images here that I could choose. And then I can take my voice, and the little image, the avatar, will become animated and will speak for me. It's really kind of cute. But if you use something like this in your class, you know, it doesn't provide captioning opportunity. So you have to be a little bit creative. You might have a blind student that doesn't see the image. So what I did is I just created a description for the whole class on what they would be seeing and hearing. And that way, if I had a deaf student involved or a blind student, they wouldn't have to disclose, but they would have full access to the content. Sometimes that's the way you can get around some inaccessible products you might run into. So in summary, to apply universal design, you can look at the overall design of the instruction by using multiple ways for people to gain knowledge, demonstrate knowledge, and engage. And you can look at the way you deliver each specific teaching. And so how you're delivering your teaching, making sure that it's accessible to everyone. Even how you're communicating with your students. You might want to communicate with them using Skype. But after this presentation, you should know that not everyone can access that Skype, probably. So just give them an option. Say you can communicate with me via Skype or email, and just let me know how you like to communicate. So you let the student know that you're flexible on the way to do that. Your choice of course content. So here it would be integrating universal design within your content. If you're teaching a programming class and students are developing web pages, for instance, ask them to make those web pages accessible to people with disabilities. That's a different topic, but there are good guidelines and standards out there that they could follow. So universal design, from my point of view, is an attitude, a goal, and a process. It values diversity, but not only valuing diversity, it values equity, all the diverse group students are in your class, and full inclusion, so they don't have to go and do something different than the rest of the class, at least in most cases. It promotes best practices and does not lower standards. It can just become a habit. It's proactive. It can be implemented incrementally. You don't have to do everything all at once. You can take one standard a quarter and add it, or one guideline from that list of 20. It benefits everyone and minimizes the need for accommodations. You still may have accommodations in your class, but there should be very few. And I'll kind of conclude with this image. I just found this image out on the internet, and it just shows a young man, I think it's a young man, at a skateboard park, and he's flipping over in his wheelchair. And my first thought as a mother was, oh my God, what's that kid doing? My second thought, well, at least he has a helmet on. But my third thought was about universal design. I don't know what they did there. I don't know if they designed that skateboard park to be accessible to people with disabilities, in particular using wheelchairs, but it is. And so to me, to some degree, that skateboard park is by definition universally designed. So as I promised, we have a few resources. You can contact me at Sheryl B, SHERYLB, at uw.edu. You can sign up for that community of practice on universal design in higher education by sending email to doit, D-O-I-T, at uw.edu. We do have a website on accessible distance learning. That's at www.uw.edu/doit/programs/accessibledl or accessdl. ACCESSDL. And the Center for Universal Design and Education that we support, www.uw.edu/doit/CUDE. And so that concludes the content here, but not our conversation. So are there any questions that you'd like to ask?
Sheryl, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, thanks. That was terrific. Thank you very much. There's lots of food for thought there, and lots of really useful information that we can use. Now, there are a few questions online. If there's any questions in the room, I'll get you to raise your hand, but I'll start with a couple online. There's a lengthy one from Sharon Kerr, if you scroll up a little. she's interested in a business case for using universal design. And she asks, do you have data with regard to student retention and engagement being improved across the board where UDL has been used? So I guess that's the number of the question there. Do you have any data on retention and engagement being improved?
No, it's more, I think you can document that students have access to things. That is documentable in courses where, I mean, just by captioning videos, that certain people have access, but they didn't have access if they weren't captioned. There is a bit of research, and there's one chapter in the book that I mentioned that actually looks for research to support the idea of applying universal design in academic settings at the post-secondary level. And I can't remember exactly how many studies they found, about 15. But the designs are questionable because the ones that do track impact of universal design, they tend to look at faculty behaviors. And so teaching the class before universally designed and interviewing the students, for instance, or surveying them, and then after universal design. And the students report that the course was more accessible, more easy to use, and so forth. And so, unfortunately, there isn't a lot of high-powered data. I think the best, if you wanted to look for the justification, probably the best justification for universal design is more in a legal case. I know you have legislation, as I do, that require that you provide that your course is in an accessible format. But I would really encourage people to do some research. We did a research study that I wish would be emulated. It was a small study, but it was to take a faculty member. Some of the material was online, some on site, but the main course was on site. Take a faculty member who was trained in universal design of instruction, look at his students before he was trained and after he was trained in the same class. And then within those, the student population, we were able to find out which of those students had a disability. And we had to go through several steps so that individual student wasn't identified to us. But we looked at the students' grades who had disabilities versus the ones without. And then after the course was done, we looked at similar grades, different students, of course. And we found that the students with disabilities grades went up where the other students stayed about the same. And to me, that says something about the universal design strategies benefiting this particular group. Because if you just look at all the students, it just might make them all go up a little, and the average isn't going to tell you much. But the good part of that study is we also did a control group. And so we took faculty members who were not trained in universal design and did a pre and post survey of their students, just like we did in the first case. And those grades of students with disabilities in their classes did not change from the first test and the last test. So it suggests that that universal design practices relative to other students will benefit students with disabilities. You can kind of guess that some of the students are doing fine the way the class is teaching, but we're looking But what we're looking is what about the disadvantaged student, in this case the student with a disability, and their grades relative to the others improved.
Thanks very much, Sheryl. Tracy Chamlin asks, in providing, where are we? Oh, sorry, I've lost the page. I've got to come up. Is the course Sheryl mentioned earlier, the Rutgers Uni course, available to open enrolments? Would we in Australia be able to enroll?
To enroll in the distance learning class that I mentioned?
I think so, yep.
Yeah, that's at Rutgers, and it's for a fee. They charge a fee for it. But if you look at the Rutgers website, it's actually part of their certificate program and getting a certificate as an online instructor. One of the classes is on universal design, accessible design, and meeting legal requirements in the United States. So they do offer it for a fee.
Okay, thank you. Natalie Collins asks, have there been any examples in the US where students have complained or litigated against a university or an institution about inaccessible course content?
Good question. I give a lot of talks on that. I didn't include it in this one because it's relevant only in the United States, but we have about 20 post-secondary institutions in the United States where the Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Justice, have brought civil rights complaints to their campuses because of the inaccessible design of their IT. And many of those specifically mention online learning, but all of them cover online learning. And the campuses had to reach a resolution with these two government agencies to continue on with their efforts. And so usually they were relative to blind students, and in a lot of cases it was a blind student that had complained multiple times about the inaccessibility of their online classes and some of the technology that's used in the classroom or students are expected to use. And so the remediation for that is in these resolutions is they have to have a systematic plan for redesign of their websites to be accessible, their PDFs, their videos need to be captioned, and so on. So yes, there is a great deal of this type of activity going on in the United States. A group of individuals who are deaf actually complained with MIT and Harvard because they were putting up free online learning mostly in the format of videos on their website, making it free to the public. And the complaint there was they weren't captioned. And the deaf community stepped forward and complained about that, and they had to either pull down those videos or caption them to keep them up on the website. People complained about that because some of the argument was, well, gee, here we're doing this service, we're letting these materials be out there for free. Why do we get penalized, so to speak, because we didn't caption them? Well, they were the ones that said they made the videos accessible to everyone, and so everyone includes people who are deaf. But if you looked at what happened in the process, if they had captioned those videos in the beginning, it wouldn't have been prohibitively expensive. Maybe out of 50 videos, they could have only made 49 because they had to pay for captioning. But those are the kind of decisions we all make when it comes to IT, whether it's security or we have to use the campus design format for something that we're doing. It's just one of the things that should be considered in the development process, both on the technical side and the use of technology and in terms of pedagogy when we're teaching the class.
Great, thank you. Another question from Natalie Collins. Question for Sheryl. Have you used students with disabilities to test your course content?
I have not for that particular course I'm teaching, but I have, oh, this is still on. Can you hear me right now? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay. A little technical glitch here. I have other materials we've created, like on our Do It website. We get feedback from students with disabilities. And some of those materials I'm using in my course. So yes, indirectly I have. But that's a good place to start. One thing to remember is, first of all, if you want to have it tested for a lot of different conditions, a person who is blind is a good tester because they have probably the most restrictions as far as accessing the content. So you'll learn a lot. But it's good to have a blind person, a deaf person, and someone with a learning disability, for instance, try your course. But the other thing to remember is that one person does not speak for the whole community. And sometimes what happens is we choose a blind student that's really technically savvy, and they can maneuver through your course, but somebody else could not. So it's always a good idea, though, to get input, even before you are at the testing stage. But getting a focus group of students together to give suggestions for it.
Okay, is there any questions in the room? I think we've covered all the questions. Is there any there that I'm missing, Tracy? Okay.
Wow.
Okay, well, we're
right on the minute.
We are right on the minute, Sheryl, and I'd like to thank you very much for your time and effort in speaking to us this morning.
You're welcome.
And thanks everybody online for coming along online and joining in with this excellent talk from Sheryl. So everyone here is clapping, and I'm sure people online are clapping. They're enjoying it, and I'd just like to thank you on behalf of UniSA. Thanks very much, Sheryl.
Yeah, well, it's been nice to me, and I'd love to come back to Australia sometime.
Okay, well, if you do, please come and visit us.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, see you. Thanks, Sheryl.
Uh-huh.